بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اليوم نرحب بضيوف حماية الكرام، ونرحب بضيفتنا الكريمة الأستاذة أروى الحمد، ونشكرها على مبادرتها لتقديم محاضرة اليوم، وأسأل الله العلي العظيم أن ينفع بعلمها ويكون عون في خدمة بلدنا المعطاء. نبذة مختصرة عن المجموعة السعودية لأمن المعلومات حماية. هي مجموعة عبارة عن تجمع للشباب السعودي المختص في أمن المعلومات، المبدع والمؤمن بالعمل التطوعي من أجل خدمة مجتمعنا وإثراء المحتوى العربي وفق منهج وتوجيهات دولتنا الحبيبة. لدينا موقع حماية، ولدينا قنواتنا على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي من خلال اليوتيوب وتويتر ومنصات تواصل اجتماعي أخرى، بالإضافة إلى إقامة بعض المحاضرات وورش العمل. ونرحب بالعمل المشترك ومبادرتكم لإثراء هذا الجانب العلمي. أكرر شكري لحضوركم اليوم، وأتمنى الأستاذة أروى كل التوفيق. تفضل.
السلام عليكم. شكرا لحضوركم، وأتمنى أنكم تستفيدوا. في صوت واضح؟ طيب، اليوم راح نتكلم عن ال Cloud Security from a customer perspective. يعني if you're an organization وتفكروا انكم you go with cloud computing, this is the presentation. These are the things that you need to think about. طيب نبدأ. A little about myself. أنا أخذت الدبلومة والباتشلر من جامعة الملك فيصل في الدمام. I did my master's degree in RMIT University of Australia. I worked in Sadat Payment System, RMIT, Accenture, Saudi Stock Exchange, and currently في General Entertainment Authority, هيئة العامة للترفيه. Professional certificates, I hold CISP, CISM, GPEN, PMP, ISO 27000 related to security, 20000 حق IT, وال 9001 related to quality and other certificates. So today in this session, we'll be talking about some statistics related to cloud and how people are adopting cloud. We're going to be talking about cloud computing service modules, the deployment modules, and we'll go through some roles and responsibilities based on a service module, and the upsides and downsides of public cloud. Service agreement, this is an important topic that we're going to talk about if you're going to cloud. The security and privacy issues and recommendations, and the outsourcing activities if you're going to outsource the cloud to a vendor. Finally, we'll go through the conclusion, and I'll recommend some certificates related to cloud. So first of all, statistics. There was a survey that shows that there's a 20% increase annually for organizations that are starting to invest in clouds. The survey was done to more than 300,000 plus members, and this is the results that they got. So first of all, يعني سألوهم the benefits that you're getting from the cloud. Is it the same as was promised or not? So 41% قالوا إنه yes, it helped reduce the cost. 46% said yes, it helps in better availability. 36% said it's more flexible scalability. However, there's 14% says it reduces complexity. Yani people go to cloud to reduce the complexity, but only 14 say yes, it does, and the rest are against it. And another important topic for organizations is the regulatory compliance. So only 13% say that they are confident that they are complying with the regulations and laws that they have to comply with. And then they ask them what are the adoption stages lil cloud. تقريبا 79% of organizations are going to adopt cloud. So either they are in the trial stage, they are in the implementation stage, or in the deployment stage. Only 21% saying they're not going to cloud. So that shows us how people are, the cloud is trending. So people are moving to the cloud. So we can see also private cloud is 30%. It's the most because it's only for one organization. We'll tell you more about the different deployment modules. 25% public cloud, and 24% the hybrid cloud. What are the barriers for adopting cloud? When they asked them, there were 53% said general security risks, 42% said legal and regulatory compliance, which is, again, emphasizing it's an important matter. Then 40% says data loss and leakage risks. 35% are talking about the concern of integrating with their existing IT environment, and 26% say that they lack the experience to adopt the cloud. What kind of data is stored on the cloud? So they asked them what kind of data they're storing on the cloud that they're using. 44% said emails, 32% customer data, 31% sales and marketing data, 30% employee data, and here we have 26% the contracts. And we can see that it increases based on the criticality of the data. There's 18% the intellectual property. They can't risk having it on the cloud. 19% the financial corporate data. So they asked them, do you have concerns about security in the cloud? 91% said they have. Either they are very concerned or moderately concerned. Only 4% said they're not sure, and only 5% say they don't have any concerns. So this shows that the cloud is a concern to everyone who's thinking about it. Then they asked them about the cloud security incidents. So they asked them if they have experienced any incidents while using the cloud. So only 9% said yes, they had incidents. 15% could not disclose it. So they might have experienced incidents, but they're not talking about it. 55% said no, and 21% were not sure. So based on these statistics, now we're going to go and learn more about the deployment modules and the service modules that are there. So the deployment modules, we have 4 modules: the public, private, community, and hybrid. The public cloud, it's owned by the cloud provider. However, it is provided to the public, so through the internet. An example is STC here in Saudi, Mobile, and we have Amazon. They're planning to have their data centers in Bahrain soon. We have the private cloud, and this also could be owned by the organization itself, or it could be owned by a cloud provider, and it's only used for a single organization. An example, if you're hosting your internal SharePoint, so that could be a private cloud. Community, this falls between the public and private cloud. So 2 or more organizations, they use the cloud together. An example of it is the PlayStation gaming network. So Sony is providing the identity access management, and the game organizations are providing the digital right management, and the end user is using it as part of the community to store his own data and use his account. Hybrid is more complex. It could be between private and community, or public and private. An example of it is an organization who's hosting its internal SharePoint. However, part of that SharePoint is accessible or by other entities outside of that organization. So the deployment module itself does not dictate how secure you are. So if you're using private cloud, that doesn't mean you are secure. And if you're using public, that doesn't mean you're not secure. It all depends on assurance, so such as policies, the controls, and the visibility that you have on and control you have over the infrastructure and the data there. And we'll discuss this in more details in the section of issues and concerns. Cloud computing service model. So that is the deployment module. Now this is the service module. So the service modules, you have 3. You have infrastructure as a service, you have a platform as a service, and software as a service. So software as a service, a lot of us use it. For example, you outsource your email the organization outsources its email or ERP or CRM. So that is a software that the cloud provides. The customer only accesses it for data. Platform as a service, this is, it gives more space to the organization. So for example, developers can develop their own applications on the platform, and then the provider takes control of the rest. And we'll go to the responsibilities. You'll see the layers and what resides under the control of the cloud provider and what resides under the cloud customer. Infrastructure as a service, this gives more control to the organization and less control with the provider, but still you will need the provider to provide you with the networking, with the servers, and we'll see it in the upcoming slide. The service module could be, for example, if you're using software as a service, it could be on a public cloud, it could be on a private cloud, or on any deployment module. So the roles and responsibilities, this is the entities that we're talking about. So before we go to the roles and responsibilities, we have the cloud service provider. We all understand that this is the organization that is providing the cloud to the customers. The cloud customer, it's you or us, the organization, because we're looking at it from the customer's perspective. So when we are leasing or renting from a cloud provider, and the regulators. The regulators are the entities that are imposed on the organization. So you need to comply with a certain law, you need to comply with a certain standard. Who are the regulators? For the financial sector, for example, we have SAMA, a regulator. They have to comply with the PCI DSS standard. So these are all regulations. The responsibilities, here, this is a really important slide. So we have, if you have an on-premises, these are the layers. So we have networking, we have storage, we have servers, virtualizations, operating system, middleware, runtime, data, and application. So if the traditional way is we have all this on premises. So it's all going to be the responsibility of the customer, cloud customer. And anything in yellow will be the cloud provider. So if we go to cloud computing, we will have infrastructure as a service. In the infrastructure as a service, the cloud provider will provide the network, the storage, the servers, and the virtualization. And then the organization itself will start running VMs to have their own operating system, their middleware, how it's going to interact together, if they're developing applications, the runtime, and the applications, the data, all of these will be the responsibility of the customer itself. Platform as a service, if you can see, the cloud provider will have more responsibility. So the cloud customer will only have responsibility of the application and data. This is their control. So they will develop applications, and the rest will be provided by the cloud. Software as a service, it will all be controlled by the provider, and the customer will only have credentials to access. So you access your email, you access a certain application. So this shows that the control, when you go from infrastructure as a service to software as a service, you have less control over the data, but you will have less responsibility, and it will cost you less, so you don't need to run these daily activities. So what would you choose from the deployment modules or service modules? So each organization, it has its intended purpose. What's the purpose of your organization? What do you do? And what are the assets that you hold? What kind of information? What kind of critical data? What kind of assets your company has? The legal obligations. What laws you have to comply with? Do you have any private information that you need to comply with a certain law? Do you need to comply with a certain standard? Now we're having the Cybersecurity Authority, هيئة الأمن السيبراني. I'm sure that they will come up with laws that all organizations, based on the data they hold, how they need to deal with it. So customer information privacy is something really important. So they would have certain laws you have to comply with if you're holding the customer data. Exposure to the public. So do you have, is the public your customers? Do you need them to access it? So how big is the exposure? The threats that your organization is facing, so you need to identify the threats. And the tolerance to risk. Each organization has an acceptable level of risk. So how much risk will you accept? And each organization, as we said, these are different from organization to organization. What works in one organization will not work in another organization. When you choose, it's mainly about doing risk management. So you see what benefits you're getting from the cloud, what is the cost that you are paying for it, and what is the benefits you're getting in return. You have to weigh the criticality and sensitivity of information that you have in your organization, and based on all of that, you make a trade-off. So is it acceptable to go to the cloud or not? We will go through the stages of outsourcing, and we'll see how we do that. So what are the upsides and downsides of the cloud? The upsides, there's staff specialization. The cloud provider, it has a large scale facility. So they would have a lot of staff, and they would have specialized staff in security. Not like other organizations where some staff, like system admin, would do his daily work and he would do additional security related work. But in the cloud provider, they would be specialized in security. That would give them more time to gain more knowledge, in-depth knowledge. They would have more time to do any improvements required or any remediation action needed. Platform strength. Again, most cloud providers would tend to go to uniformity. So they would unify their structure. For example, they would have an automated way for security. They would have a configuration management process, how to configure each technology. They would have patching management, how to patch and to make sure that everything is up to date all the time. They would have also all the security processes that they need to do. So that makes it more robust, but at the same time, it might be a downside, because if they make a mistake with one configuration, that would affect all other customers, not only you. Also, platform strength, they would tend to make sure that they are strong enough and liable, they would go to implement some standards like, again, the ISO 27001, and be compliant with the requirements of the payment credit industry. The next one is resource availability. So most cloud providers would have a disaster recovery site, and they would have redundancy. So you would that will help in making sure there's more availability. Also, when you subscribe to the cloud, then you would have an on-demand capacity. So whenever you need more storage, more space, you would have it on demand. You don't have to plan it ahead. But the downside here, the good thing is it will prevent from denial of service attacks. So even if you're under attack of denial of service, you will still have capacity. That's why it won't go down. However, the downside of this is some clouds may charge you for any extra capacity you are requiring. So you might get charged for getting the attack, the denial of service attack. So you need to make sure you clarify this with the cloud provider in advance. The backup and recovery. Many organizations use cloud as an online backup because you have your data live on the cloud. So it's not backed up on tapes and archived, and that would take time to get the tapes and restore it. And so you would have everything online. This will help you restore faster, and however, it will depend on the network performance and the internet. So, and the amount of data that you have. So that would maybe take more time to restore. So if you can see, every upside I'm saying, there is a downside associated to it. Mobile endpoints. So for the cloud providers, they extend their services through clients. The client is either a browser or an application on your phone. So that would give you more space. you can access the services that you need from anywhere, from your laptop, notebook, from your mobile phone, without worrying about you have to download a certain application or on your laptop. However, there is also a downside. You need to make sure that you are protecting these endpoints, because that could be a source of attack or vulnerability. Data concentration. So all the data would be in one place. That's why you don't need to worry about having data in different places. So you know that your data is secured in one place. However, here you need to make sure that for the users, you put appropriate access controls. So not anyone can access the full data. Everyone should access only the data that he needs to do his responsibilities or his job, or he needs to know. So we need to make sure we implement the need to know principle and the least privilege principle. The downside, we have system complexity. As we know, cloud providers have servers, they have the hypervisor, they have to do the virtualization, they have the network between them, and they would have a lot of components. This would lead to complexity of the system. And also the cloud provider could also outsource some of their activities to another organization. And this would also add to the complexity. So this will, whenever it's more complex, it will add and may increase the attack surface. So let's say hypervisors, they have their own vulnerabilities, servers, they have their own vulnerabilities. So it's adding on to that. Shared multi-tenant environment, you are sharing the same infrastructure with another customer. So do you trust that customer or not? This is a risk. The customer could, any attacker could pose as a customer and rent from this cloud provider and try then to find vulnerabilities, and they would have more visibility to the infrastructure. Internet-facing services, of course, if you want to administrate your cloud, you would go online and you have your admin application, the administrative through the internet. So you put your credentials and then you will have access to the full infrastructure. So as we know, the internet is an attractive place for attackers to try to exploit. In regular or traditional infrastructures, the administrators will have access to the servers or this kind of privileged access from the intranet within the organization itself. But now they would have to have remote access, so you need to have additional controls and security to protect it. The loss of control, as we saw in the previous slide, you saw the controls, so the responsibilities. So whenever you go to the cloud, you will, and the public cloud, you will have less control over the full infrastructure compared to the regular or traditional infrastructure. So what do? We'll talk about the service agreement in general, and then we'll go in depth for each concern we're going to talk about. So service agreements contain service level agreements. They would have privacy policy. They would have acceptable use policy, and they would have terms of use. So what does each one contain? For the service level agreement, it would contain all the services that the provider will provide you, and what is the compensation that will be given to the customer in case they do not comply or they do not meet the service, the agreed level. So let's say, for example, you're requiring from them availability 99.9%, and then they give you 99.5%, you have an outage. What will they compensate you? This is in the service level agreement. The privacy policy, this is also really important. It's how the cloud provider will handle your data, how they will collect it, how they will use it, and why is this important and critical? Because, for example, they would, I'm not talking about the regular data for the emails or your customers' data. I'm talking about you as an organization. So how you're paying, what is the trends, how you, what is the utilization, because all this information at some point would lead for people to know what your upcoming initiatives or what you're planning to do. So you need to make sure that this is clear, the privacy policy. The acceptable use policy, it's from the provider telling the customer what behaviors are prohibited. For example, they may say, a lot of cloud providers, but maybe here in STC it's not the case, but they would not allow penetration tests and vulnerability assessments. They would ask you to ask them for a report and they would give it to you. However, here in STC, they would allow it, but I'm not sure for all customers or for certain customers. Terms of use, this is really related to the rest. So the terms of use is related to the privacy policy. This would cover important details about licensing, but most important, modification to the terms of agreement. So some cloud providers, like the websites that we use to subscribe, let's say Twitter or any other social network, they change the privacy policy without directly notifying you. So they would just update it in the website, and that means it's going to apply. So you need to make sure that they cannot modify the privacy unless it's agreed between you and the provider. Types of agreements, many providers give, or it's most popular, the non-negotiable agreements. So they have one agreement for all customers. So you need to review it to see if it will match your needs or not. Some providers would allow to negotiate, and if you want to negotiate, it's really advised that you get technical and legal advice on the negotiation, and you can also have an agency helping you in that, in the negotiation. They would negotiate because of the importance of the customer. So if it's an important customer and they really want him to have his information or the power of the company, they would sometimes negotiate some of the agreement. So the privacy and security risks depend to a great extent on the terms established in the service agreement. So when we're talking about protection and security of cloud, we're actually talking about the agreement most of all, because you don't have control over the infrastructure, but you have control over what you agree between you and the provider. So the service agreements, what are the concerns that we have to address in the contract or in the agreement? I'm just going to mention them in points, and then in the next slides, the section of issues, we'll talk about them in depth. So vetting employees. The cloud providers have their own employees. How do you trust those employees? So you might need to address this in your agreement, that you need to do a certain background check, you need to have a certain clearance on your employees. Data ownership and exit right. As we said before, who's owning the data? You have to clearly state it in in your contracts or your agreements. And when you terminate, because of termination or because of bankruptcy of the provider, who will own the data after that? Breach notification. If there's any breach happening, how will they notify you? Isolation of tenant application. We'll talk about the types of isolation. Of course, there's no physical isolation when we're using public cloud. It's all logical. What kind of isolation and how are they doing the isolation? Data encryption and segregation. Are they encrypting the data at rest, in transit, and when using? Are they doing that? Is this a requirement you need? Tracking and reporting service effectiveness. You need to agree with them about how you will track the effectiveness. You need the information from them. You don't have the logs, you don't have the information. You need to agree with them on what kind of reports they have to submit to you and how you will track this. Compliance with laws and regulations. The organization has certain laws and regulations that, it needs to comply with. And this is really important because breaking the law is not something that you want to risk. So complying with laws and regulations, you have to tell them what kind of laws and regulations are applied to your organization so they can make sure that they are committing to it. And they use a validated products meeting national or international standards. So they have their own infrastructure. What kind of applications or products are they putting on their infrastructure? Sometimes these products do not meet the international standards. That means it might be a vulnerability for us to have. So again, obtaining adequate legal and technical advice is recommended to ensure that the contract or the agreement meets the organization's needs. Why can't we do it as employees? Because we don't understand all the technical aspects. We don't understand the legal, all the legal aspects. So that's why we need an agency and hire an agency to help us in understanding all the agreements and the terms to make sure that it is complying with our needs. So the important part, this section, it's about the security and privacy issues and recommendations. So we'll see all the areas of concerns, and then we'll go through each one, what the issues are in each one, and what the recommendations are. So the issues are, we have governance, we have compliance, we have the trust, we have architecture, the identity access management, the software isolation, the data protection, the availability, and the incident response. So we'll talk about each one in depth. Governance. What is governance? It implies the control and oversight the organization has on the processes or the services that are being provided to it. So what are the issues for governance? When we go to cloud, we simplify the acquisition. So we have less initial cost, we have less time to market, we can easily market our products. However, on the other hand, this amplifies the need for governance. So the concerns, there is a concern that a lot of IT professionals would say is that they're concerned that there would be a product or that's installed in the network without them knowing about it. So what about if you have the provider? How do you know what they put inside their infrastructure? So we need to govern that. Also, if we want to do risk management, the risk management, who's going to do it? Do you have the full information to do risk assessment or to do the full risk management? You need information from the cloud provider. So what kind of information, what is their responsibility and what is your responsibility? A lot of providers would say that they would not give you some information about, for example, the threats. When you do a risk assessment, you need to understand the threats, the likelihood, the historical incidents. This information, would the cloud provider give it to every customer? Maybe not. So we need to ensure that we have roles and responsibilities identified. And if they are not allowing to give it to the organization, maybe we would hire an independent auditor to audit this and do it on our behalf. So the recommendations, we have our own policies, processes, procedures that we need to comply with. We extend this to the provider to make sure that they also are complying with ours. It doesn't mismatch. There's no conflict between ours and theirs. For our agreement, of course. Define the roles and responsibilities for risk management. Put in place an audit mechanism. As I said, maybe you would need a third-party auditor. Compliance. What is compliance? It refers to the organization's responsibility to comply with any standards, any laws, any regulations. What are the issues? We have laws and regulations. Each country has its different laws and regulations. It's not the same. So we need, this is one of the issues. We need to understand that this cloud provider, what kind of laws are they complying with, and what kind of laws we need to comply with. Accountability is a really major concern. The cloud provider will commit to you and tell you, okay, we will comply with the laws that you are requesting or the standard that you are requesting. However, at the end, it's your accountability. You are accountable. You are accountable for any for complying with these laws and regulations. You cannot transfer this to the cloud provider. Data location. So as we said, the cloud provider can have different locations. They could have your data. You don't know exactly where your data is located. You need to ask, even if you ask them, it's really hard to locate exactly where it is. But you need to make sure in some way, and we can use the previous approach as having an auditor to go there to ensure that all the safeguards and controls that are required for that classification of the data is there. The visibility of the location also is a concern. As I said, it's not easy to know exactly where the location is. And if they have another site, where is it located? Is it located in the same country? Is it located in a different country? The flow of data. Let's say your data is here in Saudi and they have another location in another country. So if the data is being backed up in the other location, is that acceptable? Is that breaking any of the laws that you need to comply with? Does your law allow to have the data flowing outside or not? So all of these we need to think about them. And in security, it's really hard. When we have cyber crimes, when you come and you want to, let's say they want to see what laws are applying, it depends on the location of the attacker. It depends on how where it's going, where the data on which hops is going, and where the location of the victim is. So it's really hard. We need, and now we are currently, I think we have the laws, we have cybercrime laws issued by, I think, SAMA. They have their own cybercrime laws, صح? You don't know. You can see them, but at the end, is it gonna, are our laws going to apply or others? So the recommendations for compliance, you need to understand your organization, what kind of laws and regulations apply to you, and you have to review and assess the cloud provider's capability for complying with these laws. And finally, there's the, sorry, then I forgot, I missed the electronic discovery. The electronic discovery, this is when any, when there's, for example, an investigation or some audit bodies, they need some information. You need to know the electronic discovery is the process of identifying, collecting, analyzing, and producing the electronic stored information. So you need to make sure that the provider has all this information. It's not about they will ask you for records of your customers. They might ask you, when was this record created? When was it last modified? When was it deleted? These are all going to be in the logs. Is the cloud provider storing these kind of information or not? This is the metadata. So you need to agree with the provider to make sure it's there. Because if it's not there, you will be liable for not having this information. Next, we have trust. Because we are transferring a lot of control from the organization itself to the provider, we need to have a level of trust. What does it mean? What are the issues? We have insider access. So we all know that insiders are a threat to any organization. But if you have only your insiders, that is less risk. Now when you go to cloud, you have your insiders, you have the cloud provider's insiders, you have the cloud's customers also, you can consider them as insiders. You have your own outsourced people or outsourced organizations that you're dealing with, and you have the cloud providers outsourced services also. So this also increases the attack surface. The data ownership. So we talked about this before. We have to specify explicitly in the contract that we own the data. And of course, we have to make sure that the agreement does not allow them to do any modification or alteration without notifying us. The composite services, it's what we said. If the you are outsourcing to the cloud provider, and the cloud provider is outsourcing to another organization to provide them services. So this is nesting. So if you require from the provider availability 99.9, and the provider requires availability from its outsourced 99.95, it's you already know that if they fail, or even if they meet to 99.95, the provider will not meet what you agreed on. So This also, you need to understand the cloud provider, what kind of dependencies has to giving you your own service, and you need to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the service that's given to you. The visibility, if you want to monitor, you need to have visibility to the infrastructure. You need to have, depending on the service model. So if you have infrastructure as service, you might have access to some logs because you have control on the operating system, you have control on the application. So you have some logs, so you have more visibility. You won't have visibility to the rest. For platform as a service or software as a service, let's say software as a service, you don't. You only have even application logs, you don't have it. So how would, if an incident happens, let's say you're taking email from them and the email is down, how would you troubleshoot? How would you make sure that you know exactly what the issue is? You will need to contact them. You don't have any visibility over that. What about if it's compromised? Maybe they would restore the service, but you don't know exactly what happens. You would depend on the incident report that they would provide you. So that's another issue. You might agree with the cloud provider to have certain dashboards provided to you so you can do your own monitoring. You could agree with them on certain response time. So it all depends at the end to the cooperation of the provider. Axillary data, this is the data that is about your organization. So again, it's about your record, your profile with the provider. It's about how you do the payments. It's about what services you're taking. So all this information, it doesn't go under the information that we are already owning. So you need to agree with them on who will own this data and how they can use it. You may prohibit them from using it or selling it to others to understand the trends or your actions. Risk management, again, risk management, you need to make sure you have defined roles and responsibilities and how you would do the risk management, because all the decisions you make in your organization depends on risk management. So recommendations, ensure that service arrangements are, so the controls that you need, the processes are already the cloud provider is complying with. Establish clear exclusive ownership rights over the data, and you have to identify what kind of data. Have a risk management program, again with roles and responsibilities defined, and continuously monitor the security state, either by having an auditor every 3 months or a certain frequency going there, or you as the organization, you do the audit. There are certain organizations that would allow auditing, but they would tell you have to give us, for example, 2 weeks notice in advance. And they might tell you cannot do 2 audits unless there's a 3 month period between them. So you have to agree on this with them. Architecture. So each cloud provider has a different architecture, how they design and implement based on what service model or deployment model they are providing. So the issues here, there's, as I said, increased attack surface. All cloud providers would have a hypervisor to help in the virtualization. The hypervisor is the software or hardware that is used and between the hardware and the operating system. So you can run more than virtual machine for different operating systems. It could be for different customers. They all run at the same time. So when you have this kind of equipment, this could be vulnerable. So this is, the hypervisor is where the isolation is done. So if there is a vulnerability there, or it's a 0-day vulnerability, or there is a way bypassing this kind of isolation or confinement, then this will be a risk.
Can I add one point to the hypervisor?
Yes.
If you allow me.
Yes, please.
There is in some organization, they do hypervisor, and they do have a full cluster of operating systems. Well, the most important thing is segregating all environments, like a test environment from production environment, from other pre-production environments. This is where you have more secure, but you need actually
a good network team to do this type of segregation, to move from different subnet to another subnets.
Exactly, exactly. And as the point of view of the organization, what kind of visibility do I have on the cloud provider and how they are doing this segregation? As he said, you need a strong network team. So even, again, this brings me to the point, even if you understand the isolation, you need a technical advice to tell you, is this good enough for you or not? So, and there was a research that shows there was an FTP request that could be sent to the hypervisor, and it could corrupt a heap buffer in the hypervisor, which could allow executing some code on the hypervisor. And executing this code will definitely impact all the customers that are using the same hypervisor. Virtual network protection. So we're using, let's say we're using infrastructure as a service. So we would have our own virtual machines that we're setting up. What if we have, in our virtual machines, we have databases, we have emails, we have public, we have an intranet. So we need to do the segmentation for the network. So we would do it in the infrastructure as a service. Sometimes we would not make this information visible to the cloud provider. So we're not going to be able to use their own IDS and IPS. So we would need to have our own in our own environment. So we have to set it up. And this also brings us to another issue, that whoever is setting up these virtual machines sometimes is the same person that is configuring the IPS and IDS. So there's no segregation of duties there. So we need to make sure that we have a kind of segregation of duties, and we need to make sure that we are securing our own network. And it happened to one of the organizations that had using cloud, public cloud. So they thought that they were using the IPS and the firewall of the same provider. However, it turned out that they were just online, their website, without any firewall there. So they needed their own firewall to put it in their virtual network. Virtual machine images. So in the infrastructure as service, you run your own virtual machines. You need to make sure and have an image management process. So some attackers would take the image and an infected image and put it online. And the customer could download it and use it, and this could affect the other customers and affect the cloud provider. So you need to make sure you have a secure image. And the same as we mentioned, the different environments. Sometimes you have a development environment, and accidentally you put this development environment public to the internet. So this could be exploited by any attacker if there's any vulnerabilities, because it's still not ready to be in production. Client-side protection. This is what we're talking about: the browsers, the applications, the devices that are accessing this client. This mostly can be done by training and awareness, and if you are only confining it to certain employees accessing it, you must make sure that their endpoints are secure. So recommendations, as we said, understand the technology that the provider is using. Develop image management process for creating, using, terminating virtual machines, and deliver awareness and training to end users. Identity access management. So this is when you do the authentication and authorization and access control. So normally in your organization you would have your own identity access management. However, this might not work with the cloud provider, and it's really complicated to have two different ones if you have your own on the organization and one on the cloud. So it's better to unify them. How would you unify them? Using identity federation. This is to share and trust digital IDs between entities. It would help single sign-on, so you would create your users there and you can use the same credentials in the cloud. But it's important to make sure that it's secured against attacks, the federation identity you're using. There's separations of managed identities, so the ones you are managing as a cloud customer are segregated from the ones that are managed by the cloud provider. An example for identity federations, there's OpenID and SAML, and I'm not an expert on this field, the federation identity, but I can see that a lot of online sites are using it. For example, Google, they are, I think, using OpenID. And it's really important. It makes you have single sign-on, reliable access control. Recommendations ensure adequate safeguards are in place for authentication, authorization, and for identity access management. Software isolation. What is software isolation? Here, this is how you know how your software is isolated from others. So again, we go back to the hypervisor complexity. Depending on what type of hypervisor they're using and how they are doing the segregation, this is really important for you as a customer to understand and have technical and legal expertise reviewing it. So example of some hypervisors, there's a Zen, the KVM, they are all Linux based, but they are more complicated than regular operating systems. That's why there's, as I said, larger attack surface, you could get more vulnerabilities. Attack vectors, malicious code can escape and the confines of the virtual machine. So you and another customer are on the same, you're using the same infrastructure. So as I said, an attacker could impose as a customer and try to bypass these restrictions to get to the others. The other thing is, let's say an attacker poses as a customer and then he starts utilizing a lot of resources of that cloud provider. And he continues to utilize it, and this will affect the capacity and could cause a denial of service to all customers on that provider. Migration risks, because when you migrate a virtual machine, it doesn't halt the operating system. You can move it from one hypervisor to another without stopping the operating system. So the process of migrating also could be a vulnerable process. There was this zero-day exploit for a Hyper-VM type of hypervisor. It caused the destruction of more than 100,000 sites. So they were destroyed. The recommendations, you need to understand the virtualization, the other logical isolation techniques, and see if they meet your organization's risk tolerance. Data protection, we'll talk about isolation of data also in this section. So we have the value concentration. Why would someone rob a bank? The money is there. The money is there. Why would someone attack a cloud provider? Because the data is there. Yeah.
Or the data.
Yeah, because there's a lot of data from different customers, so it's a bank of data. When you choose the cloud provider, sometimes your threat profile for your organization is not that high. But in the same cloud providers, you have other customers that have really high threat profiles. People are targeting them. So you need to assess that also. Take it into consideration in your assessment. Do you want to be with that same cloud provider who is hosting the data of others or not? Data isolation. There's two concepts for software as a service. There's something called multi-instance and multi-tenant. So multi-instance, you as an organization, you will have your own database management system instance. However, in the multi-tenant, you will all be sharing, you and other customers, sharing the same database. However, your data will be tagged with your customer ID. So are you willing to accept that risk or not? Depending on what kind of data or the sensitivity of the data you are having. Encryption, if you want to do encryption, is it going to affect performance? Is it going to affect availability? You need to assess that And of course, you have to think of it as encryption, the database at rest, the information at rest, in motion, and when using. And if you decide to do encryption, the key management. It's going to be your responsibility as the organization to manage the keys. So you need to have a process for that to make sure it's secure. Data sanitization, after, let's say, your contract is terminated, or you have a backup, and you don't need it anymore, or the retention period is done, how will they handle the space where your data was stored? Are they going to overwrite it? Are they going to do any discussing? So it's making sure that the data is not recoverable. So you need to see what your policy and process is based on your data, how you need to destroy that data, and agree with the provider for doing that. So recommendations, you need to evaluate the suitability of the cloud provider's data management solutions. You need to take into consideration the risk of collecting organizational data, and you need to fully understand and weigh the risks involved in cryptography and key management. Availability, the organization has full set computational resources is accessible and usable. So we all know availability is you can access the data when you need it. So temporary outages, some temporary outages could happen to the cloud provider. There was once a 4-hour outage to a cloud provider due to lightning storm. Another time, Twitter was faced a 3-hour outage because of it outsourcing it to a cloud provider. Also, one cloud provider did a network upgrade, caused a 24-hour outage. And it was, I think, a mistake they implemented the upgrade all over, and they should have done it by batches to test it. So this is for temporary outages. What about if there's a permanent outage? So the cloud provider was bankrupt. It lost its facility. What will happen? So these are all issues and risks that we need to take into consideration. There was one time a cloud provider had some customers. These customers faced some fraud allegations. So the investigation bureau had to seize 100 servers from that cloud provider. So this affected other customers who were not under that same investigation. So they had all their sites also down. So it affected hundreds of customers. Denial of service, as I said, other customers can consume a lot of resources. This could cause denial of service. And one time there was a 19-hour downtime due to one customer utilizing the resources. So what is the recommendations? You have to know your availability, your data backup and recovery. You have to have disaster recovery, business continuity plans to make sure that you still can continue your business even though the cloud provider is down. The last concern is incident response. So this involves when an incident happens, you have all the steps for the incidents. You have the incident verification, analysis, containment, collection and preservation, problem remediation, restoration, and restoration. So all these steps, who will be responsible for doing each step? The complexity of the cloud service can obscure recognition of analysis of the incident. So again, we said data availability. If there's an incident that happens, we don't have the available data to troubleshoot and see what is the cause of this problem. So we need to agree with the cloud provider how it will be visible. If it's not, how will they handle it? Incident analysis and resolution. If you are using, let's say, a software as a service, and one customer is under attack or there's an incident that's happening, they might only configure the firewall to stop the traffic to that customer and allow it to the other customers. However, in some situations, they would need to put all the infrastructure, the software down, so that would affect the other customers due to an incident for one customer. So it all depends on the cooperation between the cloud provider and the cloud customer and how they agree on handling these incidents. So you need to understand the contract and make sure that you identify the procedures for incident response. You need to ensure that the cloud provider has transparency in the response process. Finally, to the final section, we have the outsourcing activities and recommendation. This is kind of a sum up for everything we talked about. So outsourcing a cloud or any other service, you have concerns. You have inadequate policies and practices, and so there could be a mismatch between the policies that you have and the others, and we talked about this before. You could have weak confidentiality and integrity guarantees. They don't have sufficient controls to guarantee that. Weak availability guarantees, they might have, it depends on the load balancing that they have and the denial of service. Principal agent problem, it's the incentive between you and the cloud provider. Are they aligned? Is your incentives aligned with them? So this gives you trust that they will do whatever they have to do to comply with the contract. Attribution of expertise. When you outsource something, you don't need to obtain the expertise in your organization. So this is also a concern that the organization has. They are giving the control and they would not have the resources that are experts in this matter. So the 3 steps for outsourcing, we have preliminary activities, we have initiating and coincident activities, we have concluding activities. So the first step in the preliminary activities, we specify our requirements. We have to put a lot of time in the planning, because in this step we are planning what we need, what the organization needs in terms of security, in terms of return on investment. So we specify the requirements. All of these we talked about and during the session. There's the personnel requirements, there's the regulatory requirements, the availability, the problem reporting, the information handling and disclosure agreements, the physical logical access controls, the network control connectivity, data protection, system configuration, patch management, backup recovery, data retention and sanitization. This is all your requirements as an organization. Security and vulnerability scanning, risk management, incident reporting, continuity of operations, resource management, certification and accreditation you need from the provider to have, the assurance levels you need, and the independent, the right to audit. So you specify all these requirements with your organization's policies, process. This is the needs of your organization. After that, you start assessing security and privacy risk. This is where you do the risk assessment. You bring the scope that you want to outsource, what controls that are there, what the cloud provider is providing based on your requirements. And we're not only talking about the personal identifiable information that you might have on the cloud. As we saw in the statistics, you might have contract agreements, you might have network diagrams, you might have vulnerability reports on the cloud. So this also, you need to make sure that you have adequate controls to secure them. And some of the important technology areas we need to review is, as we said, the logical isolation, the facilities, the backup and recovery that the provider is giving. So based on this, we do a risk assessment. And we get to a result, either it satisfies our needs, we accept it, either we need to put additional controls so we can reduce the risk to be acceptable to us, or we might change the scope. So we're not going to put this kind of data, we're just going to put this kind of data or this kind of applications, or we can just reject the idea. We need to also assess the competencies of the cloud provider. We need to see what the cloud provider staff, their experience, their technical expertise, how they are employing, the quality and frequency of security awareness and training they are giving to their employees, because this is important to us. The account management practices, how they will manage our account, the type of effectiveness of the security services providing the underlying mechanism use, the the adoption of new technologies, how do they adapt, the change management procedure, how do they do the changes, the cloud provider's track record, so their history, and their ability to meet our privacy policy. How do we do this assessment? We either ask them to demonstrate to us, so they show us how they do this, or we can ask references, so other customers, or we can have an independent evaluation. And I think we all do this for any contract or any outsourcing we do.
Is there any global independent party who's doing this?
There are, and like there's the the big four. There's KPMG, PwC. They do audits on behalf of organizations. So you hire an independent, any other that does not have conflict of interest with you or with the customer itself. Initiating, this is the second stage, initiating and coincident activities, establish the contractual agreement. So now it's time to write the contract. You have to write it in details. So when we have to have a detailed description of the service environment, including the facility location, the applicable security requirements. And when I say in details, it should be in details to cover you. You need to write the policies, procedures, standards of vetting and management of their staff, what you need them to do, predefined service levels and associated costs, the process of assessing the cloud provider's compliance with service level agreements, how you will do that, specific remedies for harm caused or non-compliance by the cloud provider, how would they remediate that, the period of performance and due dates of any deliverable. So you're going to have a contract maybe in the beginning, the development, and then the launching, so you need to have specific dates. The cloud provider's point of interference with the organization's responsibility for providing relevant information and research to cloud providers, the procedures, the protection restrictions for co-locating and commingling organized data, the cloud provider's obligation upon contract termination, so what obligations do they have if you decide to terminate it or the end date has occurred, the ownership right over the data before and after, and what kind of data, the location of organizational data within the cloud environment, the security, privacy, performance, visibility, service availability, data backup recovery, incident response, and disaster recovery. So this all has to be part of your contract. Within the same step, we assess the performance. So after we have the contract, we start assessing the performance, make sure that they have, they're maintaining their security state. We make sure that they are complying with what we agreed with. And when doing the assessment, it will help you to remediate any actions that you need to remediate in a timely manner. Finally, the concluding activities. So when you terminate the contract, or as I said, because it's ended, or the bankruptcy of the cloud provider, so you need to do these steps. First, you have to tell the provider what obligations they have. So the non-disclosure agreement, the sanitization of the organization data on their storage media, and then you start eliminate physical and electronic access rights. So if they have access, you start removing that access. If it's physical access to your buildings, if it's logical access, you need to start doing that. And then recover organizational resources and data. So depends on your agreement, who's going to take the software, who's going to take the data, how you're going to move it, the software, and so on. So to conclude, these are the 3 steps. In the preliminary activities, you identify your requirements, you analyze the cloud provider's controls, and then you evaluate if their ability to comply with your needs. In the initiating and coincident activities, you ensure that all the contract agreements are written. You have continual, you involve legal advice in the contract, and you continually assess their performance. Finally, in the concluding activities, you alert the cloud provider about your contract agreements, you revoke all their accesses, and you ensure that your resources are handled as per your agreement. So in conclusion, The emphasis on the cost and performance benefits from the cloud provider needs to be balanced with your security and privacy needs, the organization. Accountability for the security of the data, it's always the organization's responsibility. You cannot transfer it to the cloud provider. The transition to outsourced public cloud environment in many ways is an exercise of risk management. So you have to weigh your needs, your requirements, and what they can offer, and you do a risk assessment. The cloud computing is a new computing paradigm. It's still emerging. Technology is advancing, so is security and privacy controls. Professional certificates related to cloud. There's the CCSP, the Certified Cloud Security Professional from Cloud Security Alliance. I started reading the book actually, and if you read the CIS book, it's a summary of it, but a little bit twists for the cloud. There's a Certificate of Cloud Security Knowledge, Cloud Security Alliance, Certificate Integrator Security Cloud Services from XN, and CompTIA Cloud Plus from CompTIA, and they're the Professional Cloud Security Manager Cloud Credentials. If there's anyone here took any certificates, maybe they can share their experience of this. The CCSP? Okay, how was it?
It was good.
It was good.
At what stage? Is it advanced or?
No, I think it's basic.
It's basic?
Yes, concentrate on risk assessment. And I think one of the most important key to be mentioned is cloud cloud control metrics.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's help cloud consumer to assess cloud provider based on a certain specific questions.
Okay.
Covering most important security topics.
Great.
And the cloud consumer can use this. It's an Excel sheet.
Okay.
So we can use it to assess cloud provider.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's great. It's a certificate or?
No. It's provided by Cloud Security Alliance. And
Okay.
it's a cloud control matrix.
Okay.
CCM.
Yeah. Okay. That's great.
Means there is no relation. There is no technical things in that certificate. Just it's management.
It's about I think it's about risk assessment,
Yes.
risk management, and risk assessment.
So it's like what we talked about here. It's more governance. As a
Yes,
cloud
governance.
customer, you are governing more than you need the technical. You need to understand it, but at the end, you are just governing it. Any other certificates or experience?
No, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Are we done with the certificate? I can ask a question.
Yes, we're actually done. So please, any questions?
It's interesting me that mainly actually when you want a cloud service, you really need to look at the legal point of it, okay? Because you cannot transfer the risk. You will be responsible about the risk. You cannot transfer the accountability, as you said, because you still be accountable, in front of your customer or whatever, or your government or whatever.
True.
So the legal aspect, wherever is the customer, the cloud customer, he needs really to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have any, from your experience, you worked in a bank, I guess, or from your work experience?
A little bit in financial sector in Saudi Stock Exchange, but now in the General Entertainment Authority.
So so the thing is, do we have like a legal framework worldwide for the cloud, or we still don't? From whatever.
I was, if someone else knows, but I'll say what after I researched, I didn't find any framework, but if anyone knows about it, please share it with me. I really need it. Yeah, I think maybe the Cybersecurity Authority that is being established, we're hoping that it will have these clarified and will help us in that matter. But you need to make sure, in the legal point of view, you need to, if you're a critical organization, you won't go to a cloud outside of your country because you need to cover yourself with your own laws. You don't want their own laws applying on you.
جميل. في نقطة ممكن أضيفها.
تفضل.
فيما يخص الترانسفير لأي ريسك، ممكن إنه إذا أنت identify a risk management treatment plan very well, you can be smart and transfer your risk to the third parties. يعني هنا يعتمد على التريتمنت بلان اللي انت معتمدها بيست على الريسك اكسبتنس من الاورجنايزيشن نفسها.
You transfer their treatment. You transfer that they will treat it instead of you treating it, but you still it's the risk of your organization. It's not their risk.
اي انا فاهم بس اقصد انه كلايبيلتي ولا accountability you own the risk. That's definitely ما في اي مشكله. بس انا اتكلم عن انه transfer.
Yes, we
transfer the risk you can do it.
Transfer to whom?
To a third party.
Is there third parties here?
هذا depends على الفريم ورك اللي انت بنيته.
But no, I mean, is there any third party here in Saudi Arabia can deal with those, you know?
Yes.
Like
There is many insurance company. عندك كثير من شركات التأمين الآن بدأت تستقبل.
Like تعاونية.
كله نعم.
They can deal
صحيح.
with.
في الأورجنايزيشن اللي نعمل فيها نعم. موجود.
معلش أضيف واحدة من الأشياء المهمة في الريسك assessment إنه زي ما تفضلت أروى إنه الكلاود is a very complex environment. يعني هي عبارة عن deployment model مبني عليها service model مبني عليها السيرفيس itself أو API. فالريسك is inherited through these layers.
Yes.
وهذا is very complicated.
Exactly.
How to assess the risk of cloud provider is very difficult process, and how to choose which cloud provider is best for you from security point of view is very difficult.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and as we know, is availability, reliability, and confidentiality is very important to us as security professionals. So how to assess this aspect of cloud provider? They will not give you more detail about their security infrastructure. So يعني في communication ما بين cloud provider و cloud customer or how they communicate to each other in security matter is very difficult.
Yes.
Program.
Yes, as I said, a lot of this depends on the cooperation of the cloud provider with the cloud customer. Are they going to answer your inquiries? And one of the issues we talked about is trust. We need to have trust. We need to have make sure that we are aligned. So, and again, as I said, and I'm repeating it, you cannot review the contract alone. You need another agency with technical experience, an agency for technical advice and an agency for legal advice. It's not only one. So if you have the contract right in the beginning, that will make your life easier later on. Yes.
Suppose I am the, the security officer of organization A, and I would like to, have to move some of my services to the service provider. And you said there is, some agencies that can help me to, to understand the, the service level agreement. Here in Saudi Arabia, what those agencies that I can deal with them to let me understand the service agreement with the service provider.
So you're talking legal point of view or technical point of view?
Both.
Both. Because I think it's you won't find one organization dealing with both. So it's better to have the legal with a legal firm and to have the technical with technical consultants or advisors. I don't know exact names that are really capable of it. And from my experience, we tried some. It wasn't a successful experiment, so I wouldn't prefer sharing them with you.
I believe you can have it even if it's a global one.
Yes.
There is nothing because the people working globally, they don't care where are you. They will go take the separate provider, analyze their access, and then see what laws in your area and what laws in the provider area, and then they combine. This is their work.
And that's another challenge. Our laws are still not clear enough. That's another challenge. So you have to think ahead. So maybe we should take the laws. This is what we're trying to do. Take the laws from other countries that we think would be applied in our country, like the Privacy Act, the Health Information Privacy Law. All this, we are sure that it will come to our country. It will be part of our laws. So why don't we think about it in advance? That's the challenge when we start doing the agreement now. We don't want to do it based on what we have now. It's going to be too easy to do it, and then we will have complications later on.
Or flexible terms in the contract, like and or whatever the KSA will apply in the future and so on.
Exactly.
So you have flexible.
Exactly.
And I think it's better to start from your organization, make a risk assessment, asset evaluation, yes, and put the security requirement of each asset. Then based on that, you decide what is your security requirement exactly for each data, and what is the security level that could this provider give to you. So based on this, you can take a decision if it's better to migrate this data to cloud or keep it hosted in private or local network.
That means every organization, they should have their legal employees and
Yes.
to evaluate all the assets and
as she mentioned before, there's a different kind of cloud. You can choose based on your security requirements. You can choose private cloud rather than public cloud.
Yeah, you're talking about service level agreement, which is only covering what I know. It's only covering quality of service and availability. So it's I think easy to.
Service level agreement could cover other things. It depends on what you specify, but it's what service is being provided to you and what level you need it. It could be defined in, for example, percentage for availability. It could be for response and responding to your any open ticket. So any service that you want would yes.
And for the global providers, like Amazon, based on your research, you said that they will open a data center in Bahrain.
Yeah.
Why they don't open it here in Saudi Arabia? Is there any restriction?
Yes.
There's some restriction.
Maybe I believe they are planning maybe in later stages. I can't talk on their behalf, but
No, based on your research, I mean.
I can't give you. I will just give you assumptions from my own. I would assume that they don't have clear laws and regulations that they can defend themselves against or something. But this is my own assumption. I'm not sure.
I agree with that.
Yes.
Thank you for this rich information. One of the benefits of cloud and moving to the cloud services to reduce the cost. When we talk with the small and medium company, this will be difficult on them, and I think it will be more expensive than they own their data center or on-premise services. So if there is a way, especially when we deal with a big cloud company, they don't negotiate with the agreement. You have to accept their agreement.
Their own agreement.
Which is, we have to rethink with our privacy dealing with this agreement, especially if we deal with the security and secure data should be not safe or in places. Another question of different part, and this is a research topic. If we want to put a data and divide it between different cloud companies, so if I encrypt that data and save it in different places, not in same provider, different provider, does that will affect my data, the availability responsible of that data, if one of them, I'm thinking not to be in one point of failure using one cloud computing company, so as that can be work or not.
Yeah, that's a great point you brought up. Some people use more than one cloud, so I would go with STC as my main site and with Mobile as my disaster recovery site. So if this goes down, I still have another. Some people would have their own site as the main site and the cloud, or vice versa. The first question you said about the small companies, yeah, this is a really complex process. But again, as I said, all this process depends on your risk acceptance level. I think as a startup or small, your risk acceptance level is higher. You don't have a lot to lose, yeah. So, and you have to analyze what kind of data you are taking from the customers and putting them on the cloud. So again, we go back to risk assessment for doing that.
I have a very open-ended question, I think. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the blockchain technology.
The blockchain?
Yeah.
Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was wondering if you know what are the differences and similarities between the security concerns of the blockchain and the cloud.
صراحة ما ودي أفتي يعني. But I know that the blockchain is not يعني it's not traceable. So يعني it's secure in the design. أما يعني I think you're talking about kind of different concepts. Cloud you can يعني use it as يعني بدل infrastructure اللي عندك this is what you use to reduce the cost. What you're talking about, maybe the blockchain is...
It's more distributed. The cloud is central, and the blockchain is distributed.
Yes,
So
the
it's
blockchain is
different domains. في أسئلة يا إخوان؟ نختم.